From the outside, my life looked flawless. I lived in a glass-walled house on a hill that caught every sunset, a place where marble floors gleamed like mirrors and imported candles burned for no one. Ryan called it our palace, though it always felt like a museum I wasn't allowed to touch. I used to run my fingers along the spotless counters, pretending I belonged in the world he built, a world that ran on money, reputation, and silence. In the beginning, his attention felt like sunlight. He had this confidence that pulled people in, the kind that made waiters stumble over themselves to refill his glass. When he chose me, a girl with thrift store heels and a borrowed purse, I thought I'd won the kind of love that rewrites your destiny. He said I grounded him. I didn't realize grounding meant being buried. We had everything people envy: weekend getaways to wine estates, a garage that smelled like leather and ambition, a wardrobe filled with designer apologies for affection he didn't know how to give. On Instagram, our smiles were bright enough to blind the truth. Behind those posts was a quiet ache that no filter could soften. Ryan liked to remind me of how far I'd come, how far he'd lifted me. "You're lucky, you know," he'd whisper against my ear at charity galas. "Most girls would kill for your life." I smiled, because disagreeing would ruin the evening. That was the unspoken rule: never embarrass him. I learned to tuck my discomfort beneath laughter, like folding a napkin over a stain no one was supposed to see. The house was always full of noise, phones ringing, guests gossiping, but somehow it was the loneliest place I'd ever been. Every decision went through him. What I wore, who I met, even what color the walls should be. "Neutrals are timeless," he'd say. But what he meant was, don't stand out. I stopped painting my nails red after he called it distracting. I stopped singing in the kitchen when he said it echoed too much. Slowly, I stopped being anything that didn't fit the decor. People called me lucky. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that comfort could make up for the small humiliations, the way he corrected my grammar in front of friends, or how his eyes rolled when I shared an opinion at dinner. I told myself he was stressed, that men like him carried pressure ordinary people couldn't understand. But some nights, when he worked late and the house was too still, I'd sit on the balcony and feel the weight of the silence pressing on my chest. Once, I found a photograph of us from our first anniversary, me in a red dress, glowing with naive happiness. I barely recognized that girl. Her eyes were wide with hope. Mine had learned to look away. I kept the photo hidden in a drawer, as if the memory itself was forbidden. I remember the day it hit me that I'd traded my voice for velvet chains. We were at brunch with his colleagues, and someone joked about how Ryan domesticated the wild one. He laughed, saying, "She was a sweet project." The table joined in, their laughter sharp and echoing. I laughed too, because that's what good wives do. But something cracked that morning. The sound was quiet, just a thought at first, but it spread through me like a fracture line in glass. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, the city glittering behind me, and tried to picture my life without him. I couldn't. Every dream I'd ever had been replaced by his. Every decision I'd made had been measured by his approval. I realized I'd become an accessory to someone else's success story. Ryan came home late, smelling of whiskey and expensive deals. He kissed my cheek and told me to order new jewelry for an upcoming dinner. "Something elegant, not loud," he said, then disappeared into his study. His words clung to me, a reminder that I existed to complete the image. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling's faint reflections of city lights, I wondered if he'd ever noticed that his perfect life was missing something human. I wondered if I'd ever find the courage to remind him. That thought, tiny and fragile, was the first crack in the golden cage. It started on an ordinary morning that smelled of coffee and cold marble. Ryan sat at the dining table scrolling through his emails, the light from his phone flashing across his sharp features. He barely looked up when he said, "We've been invited to a dinner next week. My investors are hosting. You'll come, of course." His tone wasn't a question. It never was. I nodded, trying to sound cheerful, but his next words landed like ice. "Just make sure you look less provincial this time." Provincial. The word hung in the air, heavy and cruel. I didn't ask what he meant. I'd learned that questions only invited more condescension disguised as advice. Still, I felt something tighten in my chest. I had spent years trying to fit into his world, learning which forks to use, which designers were acceptable, how to laugh quietly without showing too much enthusiasm. Yet it was never enough. That evening, I opened my closet and stared at rows of expensive dresses he had chosen for me. Nothing felt like mine anymore. I ran my hand over a pale silk gown, still tagged, still untouched. Too loud, he'd said last time I tried it on. I picked up a black one instead, safe, silent, invisible. Ryan appeared behind me, his reflection towering over mine in the mirror. "Good," he said, eyes scanning me like an investment he was reconsidering. "Understated elegance suits you. Don't overdo the makeup either. They appreciate natural beauty." Natural beauty, another one of his phrases that really meant, don't draw attention. All week, I rehearsed smiles and small talk. I read articles about his investors so I wouldn't embarrass him. I even practiced posture in front of the mirror until my back ached. I told myself this dinner could be a chance to show him I belonged, that maybe he'd see me as his equal instead of his accessory. Deep down, I still craved his approval, like a starving person mistaking crumbs for affection. The night of the dinner arrived in a blur of perfume and nerves. The car glided through the city, lights streaking across the tinted windows like memories I wanted to escape. Ryan talked about stocks, partnerships, numbers I didn't understand. I smiled and nodded at all the right moments. He looked perfect, tailored, confident, untouchable. I felt like the shadow of his success. When we entered the restaurant, every head turned toward him. The maitre d' greeted us by name, leading us to a private dining room filled with laughter that smelled like money and arrogance. Ryan squeezed my hand, not tenderly, but as a reminder, behave. Throughout the evening, I played my part flawlessly. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny, listened to business talk that didn't include me, and smiled through subtle jabs disguised as compliments. "You're so lucky," one woman said, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Ryan must keep you busy. He always said you're still learning the ropes of this world." Her tone was syrupy sweet, but her eyes were sharp. Ryan didn't defend me. He never did. He chuckled and added, "She's trying her best. We're polishing the edges, as if I were a project he was refining for display. I felt the blood rise to my face, but I kept my composure. I'd perfected the art of swallowing hurt behind a practiced smile. When the waiter poured wine into my glass, my hands trembled slightly. Ryan noticed and leaned close enough for only me to hear. "Try not to look so nervous," he murmured. "Confidence is attractive." That was when I realized he didn't want a partner. He wanted a prop. Something elegant, quiet, and polished enough to make him look complete. As we drove home, city lights flickered against my window like silent spectators. Ryan hummed to himself, content, while I stared at my reflection in the glass. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, perfectly hollow. For the first time, I saw the truth clearly. I could never be enough for a man who built his worth by making others feel small. That dinner wasn't just another event. It was the beginning of the end. I didn't know it yet, but that invitation would unravel everything. The restaurant glowed like something out of a dream, crystal chandeliers dripping light, golden reflections dancing on every glass surface. It was the kind of place where even the air felt expensive, and I could almost convince myself that I belonged there. Almost Ryan was in his element. He shook hands, clapped shoulders, and drew laughter from everyone around him with the ease of a man who knew the world admired him. I watched him glide through conversations, charm in full display, while I stood at his side like a carefully chosen ornament. The servers whisked around us in silent choreography, pouring wine that cost more than my first car. We took our seats at the long table, polished silver gleaming beneath the soft light. I sat between Ryan and a man named Victor, one of his major investors. Ryan had spoken about him often, always with a mix of admiration and envy. Tonight, he was performing for him. As the appetizers arrived, Ryan began his favorite game, self-deprecating stories that somehow always circled back to his success. I'd heard them all before, how he started from nothing, how he never gave up, how he learned the value of hard work. But tonight, he added a new twist. He turned to Victor and gestured toward me with a grin. "And this one," he said, patting my hand like a proud owner, "is my charity project. Found her in a small town with big dreams and no direction. I guess I've always had a soft spot for the underdogs." Laughter rippled around the table, warm, polite, cruel. My stomach clenched. I wanted to believe they misunderstood him, that maybe he was joking. But Ryan's smile told me he knew exactly what he was doing. Victor chuckled. "You've done well for yourself, Ryan. A woman like her must be grateful." Grateful. The words scraped against my chest. I looked down at my plate, forcing my expression into something neutral. The soup blurred as tears threatened, but I blinked them away. I could almost hear Ryan's voice in my head. "Don't embarrass me," he went on, embellishing his story, weaving humor out of humiliation. "When I met her, she was working at some local boutique. Remember, darling? Selling handmade trinkets and calling it art." He laughed, and the table followed. "I told her if she really wanted to live, she needed to see the world. So I brought her into mine." My lips curved into a fragile smile that felt like glass splintering against my skin. I wanted to disappear into the white tablecloth. Inside, shame and fury battled for dominance. I remembered those early days, how I'd proudly made jewelry by hand, dreaming of opening my own shop. He'd once admired that ambition, said it was endearing. Now it was a punchline. The laughter softened into murmurs of approval, and conversation drifted elsewhere. But I couldn't unhear it. Every time someone smiled at me, I imagined what they were thinking. That I was lucky, that I should be thankful he'd chosen me. Ryan leaned close, whispering in my ear, "Smile more. You look cold." His breath smelled faintly of wine and arrogance. I obeyed. I always did. Dinner stretched into hours. Plates changed, wine flowed, and the room grew louder. Ryan grew bolder with every sip, his voice commanding the room. He bragged about business ventures, trips abroad, even the charity foundation he barely managed. I barely spoke. Every time I opened my mouth, he found a way to interrupt, to redirect attention back to himself. Then came the toast. Victor raised his glass first, praising Ryan for his brilliance and discipline. Others followed, offering compliments that fed his ego until it nearly burst. Ryan stood, smiling, eyes gleaming like he was about to deliver the finale of a show. He lifted his glass and said, "And to my beautiful wife, my greatest project." Laughter again. I froze, he continued, voice dripping with mock affection. "When we met, she told me she wanted to start a business selling her handmade jewelry. I told her she should start by learning how to balance a checkbook." The table erupted in laughter. But look at her now, dressed like a queen, living the dream. Proof that sometimes even homemade dreams can shine under the right guidance. Applause. Real, genuine applause. My smile didn't reach my eyes. Inside I was breaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling beneath the tablecloth. Every laugh felt like a nail sealing the lid of the person I used to be. Ryan clinked his glass against mine, a smirk tugging at his lips. "To transformation," he said. I whispered. "To illusion." He didn't hear me. The dinner moved on, but I was somewhere else entirely. Back in that tiny apartment I once loved, surrounded by the scent of metal and clay, creating beauty with my hands. I remembered who I was before I became a performance piece in someone else's success story. By the time dessert arrived, I had made a quiet decision. I didn't know how or when, but I wouldn't let him rewrite my story again. That toast might have humiliated me, but it also woke something fierce and alive inside me. And soon, he would regret ever calling me his charity project. When the laughter finally faded into the clinking of dessert spoons and the hum of polite conversation, I felt the last thread of composure inside me snap. My hands were still trembling, but I smiled through it, excusing it as the chill of the air conditioning. Ryan was too busy basking in admiration to notice. I leaned close to him and whispered, "I'm not feeling well. Just a headache. I think I'll go freshen up." He barely looked at me. "Don't take too long. They're serving the wine pairing soon," he muttered, his eyes still fixed on Victor. I nodded, pushing back my chair slowly so it didn't scrape. Every step I took away from that table felt like peeling a layer of suffocation off my chest. The hallway leading to the restrooms was quiet, lined with mirrors that caught reflections of me. Perfect dress, perfect hair, perfect lie. I stopped in front of one. For a long moment I just stared. My reflection looked like a stranger. The woman in the mirror wore elegance like armor, but her eyes were hollow, dulled by years of keeping peace in a gilded cage. I pressed a hand to my stomach, steadying my breath. This wasn't just embarrassment. It was revelation. In that instant, I realized I wasn't running from humiliation. I was stepping away from captivity. I didn't want to be someone's success story, someone's ornament. I wanted to be my own beginning again. I turned and walked toward the restaurant's entrance. The maitre d' gave me a polite smile, offering to call for my driver, but I shook my head. "I'll walk," I said softly. My purse sat on the back of my chair. My phone, my wallet, my keys, all left behind. For the first time in years, I had nothing but myself, and it felt strangely liberating. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the noise of the restaurant collapsed behind me, replaced by the quiet pulse of the city night. The air was cool and real against my skin. I drew in a deep breath that didn't belong to anyone else. He would notice soon. He'd text, then call, maybe send the driver to find me. But I didn't care. Let him explain to his guests where his charity project had gone. Let him spin another story. I was done being his character. The sound of my heels against the pavement echoed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Steady, certain, alive. Streetlights painted long golden streaks across the sidewalk, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small beneath them. I felt seen, by myself. I walked past shop windows and quiet cafes, each step stripping away the layers of his world. I thought of all the times I'd swallowed words to keep him calm, all the dreams I'd tucked into silence because they embarrassed him. Each memory felt like another chain unclasping. A light drizzle began to fall, cold but clean. I lifted my face to it, letting mascara streak without care. The city blurred, and for once I didn't rush to fix myself. I just kept walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I wouldn't turn back. I wasn't escaping a man anymore. I was walking toward the woman I'd forgotten how to be. Behind me, that glittering restaurant, the stage of my humiliation, shrank into the distance, swallowed by the night. Ahead, the street stretched wide and uncertain, but it was mine. In silence, I walked on. The first night, I slept in a small park 2 blocks from the hotel. I sat on a cold bench, wrapping my shawl tighter around my shoulders as city lights flickered like distant stars. I had no phone, no money, and nowhere to go. The irony wasn't lost on me just hours ago. I'd been dining beneath crystal chandeliers. Now I was counting minutes until sunrise. By the 3rd night, exhaustion made me desperate enough to borrow a stranger's phone. I scrolled through a few old numbers I'd memorized. Most were outdated, disconnected, or belonged to people who'd quietly vanished when I'd married Ryan. But then I found one I remembered by heart. Mara. She picked up on the 2nd ring. Her voice was surprised but warm. "Oh my God, is that you?" An hour later, I was wrapped in one of her faded blankets, sitting on her couch, tears streaming down my face. Mara hadn't changed much. Still practical, still kind, still the woman who once called me unstoppable back in our journalism days. Her small apartment smelled of coffee and lavender detergent, and it felt more like home than that mansion ever did. "I don't even recognize myself anymore," I confessed, my voice shaking. "I gave everything up for him. I used to write, remember? I had plans." Mara looked at me over her mug. "You didn't give it up. You paused it. Now it's time to hit play again." Her words hit harder than she probably intended. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside. Flashbacks flooded me. The day I'd told Ryan I got offered a feature editor position, and how he'd laughed. "Why would you waste your time on that? You don't need to work anymore," he'd said, slipping a diamond bracelet on my wrist as if it were a trade, and I'd accepted it. I'd convinced myself that comfort equaled love, that dependence equaled security. But now, stripped of both, I realized how hollow that bargain was. The next morning, Mara handed me a cup of coffee and an old laptop. "Write something," she said simply. "Anything. Remind yourself who you are." I hesitated at first. My fingers hovered above the keyboard like they were afraid of being wrong. But then I started typing, about the dinner, the humiliation, the years of quiet compliance. The words came like a storm breaking open, raw and unfiltered. Hours passed before I looked up. Mara had gone to work, leaving a note on the counter. "Keep going. You have a voice people need to hear." For the first time in years, I believed it. That night, I opened the laptop again, writing until my eyes burned. I wrote about power disguised as love, about women who disappear inside gilded cages, and about finding the courage to walk out barefoot and empty-handed. Each sentence felt like oxygen. Somewhere between exhaustion and hope, a decision formed in me, not to just survive, but to rebuild. I didn't know how yet or where to start, but I knew I wouldn't crawl back. By dawn, I had a rough plan. I'd pitch my story under a pseudonym to an online women's magazine. I'd start freelancing piece by piece. It wasn't empire level yet, but it was mine. I stood by the window as sunlight crept across the skyline, warming the city I once feared. It looked different now, less intimidating, more possible. I wasn't the woman who left a dinner party in tears anymore. I was the woman who had nothing to lose and everything to reclaim. And that's a dangerous kind of freedom. The design firm was tucked between a thrift shop and a bakery, its sign barely legible in the morning glare. Inside, it smelled of coffee, paper, and ambition, an intoxicating mix I hadn't felt in years. I got the assistant job after sending dozens of applications under a different name. They didn't care about my past, my husband, or my fall from grace. They just needed someone who could type fast and stay late. It wasn't glamorous. I fetched lattes, organized sample boards, and took notes while the real designers debated color palettes for clients who could afford marble countertops for guest bathrooms. Every time someone barked my name, I flinched, but I stayed silent, learning everything. At night, I collapsed onto Mara's couch, sore and exhausted, my hands still smelling faintly of glue and ink. But beneath the fatigue, something new flickered, a quiet, fierce energy. The humiliation I'd once feared no longer scared me. I'd already been broken in front of chandeliers. This was nothing. I started watching how projects were pitched, how charm, confidence, and strategy turned ideas into income. I took notes in secret, studying patterns, price margins, how to speak in a room full of egos without shrinking. I didn't want to just assist. I wanted to understand the mechanics of power. Sometimes the junior designer, Claire, would snicker when I stayed late. "You're trying too hard," she'd say, tossing her hair. "No one's promoting an assistant." I smiled politely, but inside her words ignited me. Trying too hard was the only thing that had ever saved me. Every morning, I walked past luxury stores with window displays that reminded me of Ryan's world. The silk dresses, the sleek cars parked out front. But instead of feeling envy, I felt strategy forming. I didn't crave their approval anymore. I wanted mastery. I wanted control over my own narrative, the kind Ryan had stolen and rewritten for me. One evening, the boss, Mr. Lang, caught me reworking a client proposal after hours. "You're not paid to do that," he said, half amused, half irritated. I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "I know," I replied steady, "but I wanted to see how it could be better." He studied me for a long moment before walking away without another word. The next day, he handed me my own small project, a low-budget cafe redesign. "Let's see what you can do," he said. It was the first time someone had trusted me with something real in years. I poured everything into it, my taste, my restraint, my defiance. When the client called later, thrilled with the concept, Mr. Lang just nodded and muttered, "Not bad. Assistant." But I caught the flicker of respect in his eyes. That night, I walked home under the hum of city lights, my reflection following me in darkened windows. My posture had changed. My steps were deliberate. The woman staring back wasn't fragile anymore. She was learning to sharpen her edges, to channel pain into precision. I didn't know it then, But those late nights and small victories were planting something in me. An empire in seed form. Invisible but inevitable. Every whispered doubt, every dismissive glance, every sigh of superiority I endured only fed the fire inside me, and one day I knew that fire would burn bright enough for everyone, including Ryan, to see. Rejection became my morning coffee. Every email that began with, "We regret to inform you," felt like a dare instead of a defeat. I collected them like battle scars, proof that I was trying, proof that I was alive again. When my cafe project gained small local buzz, I took that momentum and ran. I designed a few handbags on weekends, simple but bold, pieces I wished I'd carried back when my life looked perfect from the outside but felt like captivity. I called the collection VOW. The name came to me late one night as I stared at my reflection in the dark window. It was a vow to never lose myself again. The first pitch meeting was brutal. 3 investors sat across from me in polished suits, their expressions practiced and bored. One flipped through my lookbook and said, "This is sweet, but the market's oversaturated. You should consider licensing your ideas to someone with reach." Another laughed lightly. "You'd need a miracle or a millionaire husband to pull this off." I smiled, even as my stomach twisted. "I had one once," I said quietly. "Didn't help much. They dismissed me, but I walked out taller than I walked in." At night, I worked under a dim lamp in Mara's kitchen, tracing designs on recycled sketch paper. The hum of the refrigerator became my background music, the ticking clock my metronome. Every time my eyelids grew heavy, I pictured Ryan's smirk at that dinner table, the way he'd made me feel small, provincial, replaceable. That memory became caffeine for my resolve. When a boutique owner told me my work was too emotional for high-end retail, I thanked her politely and went home to sew through the night. I stitched anger into silk, defiance into seams. By morning, I had 3 new pieces that looked like power reborn. Sharp lines, unapologetic contrast, a whisper of rebellion in every thread. Months passed in that rhythm. Rejection, exhaustion, creation, repeat. My savings were gone, my hands calloused, but my purpose was diamond clear. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Mara started calling me the comeback storm. Sometimes she'd find me asleep over my sketch pad and cover me with a blanket, murmuring, "Keep going, Ray. You're almost there." The first small order came from an independent online magazine that wanted to feature women-led startups. They needed one handbag design for a photo shoot. I had 3 days and barely enough money for fabric. I borrowed, begged, and somehow finished it, a minimalist ivory clutch embossed with a subtle gold V. When the photos went live, something shifted. Comments poured in. "Who made this?" "VOW. That's such a powerful name. It feels like a story in itself." I cried quietly that night, staring at my laptop screen. It wasn't fame. It wasn't money. But it was validation, from strangers who saw me for what I was trying to build, not who I used to belong to. After that, the no's didn't sting the same. They became sparks. I learned to negotiate, to pitch sharper, to price my worth. I taught myself branding through online courses, took freelance gigs for extra funds, and networked with people who spoke the language of resilience. There were still days I wanted to quit. When the sewing machine jammed, when bills piled up, when a shipment went missing. But each setback reminded me of the luxury dinner, the laughter, the humiliation. Every no echoed like a challenge. Prove us wrong. I did. One day, while packaging my 5th online order, I realized I hadn't thought of Ryan in weeks. The empire I was building wasn't built on rage anymore. It was built on transformation. The pain that once chained me had become the material I was weaving my life with. I wasn't the woman who'd walked out of that restaurant empty-handed anymore. I was the woman who had turned every closed door into firewood, and soon I'd light the match. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that began with black coffee and a to-do list longer than my patience. I was answering customer emails when my phone started vibrating nonstop. At first, I thought there was a glitch, but then Mara burst into the room waving her tablet. "You need to see this," she said, breathless. On the screen was a photo of actress Lila Stone. one of those effortlessly magnetic women adored by millions. She was stepping out of a car in Los Angeles, paparazzi flashes exploding around her. In her hand was a VOW clutch, the same ivory design I'd once stitched in Mara's kitchen by the light of that flickering lamp. My heart slammed against my ribs. Beneath the photo, a caption read, "Lila Stone spotted carrying new indie designer brand VOW." Within an hour, my inbox overflowed. Boutiques, stylists, journalists, even overseas distributors. My small website crashed under the traffic. By evening, I had hundreds of pre-orders, all for the same bag that had once been dismissed as too emotional. I laughed and cried all at once, my hands shaking as I refreshed the screen over and over. Mara hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." But when the excitement settled into the quiet hours of night, something else crept in. Fear. "Imposter syndrome, the old ghost of unworthiness," whispered in my ear. "What if it's a fluke? What if they realize you're just the woman he mocked?" For a fleeting moment, I thought about Ryan. I imagined his expression if he saw the headlines. He'd probably smile, that polite, detached smile, pretending not to care while his pride cracked underneath. The temptation to send him the article clawed at me, to let him know that the provincial wife he once paraded as a joke had built something beautiful without him. But I didn't. Instead, I poured my energy into fulfilling every order. I hired 2 part-time assistants, rented a tiny studio space, and turned the chaos into creation. The work was relentless. Days blurred into nights, fingers blistered, deadlines crashed against exhaustion. But it was mine. Every stitch, every label, every customer message of gratitude became proof that I'd built this life with my own hands. When the first magazine interview request arrived, I nearly declined. Talking about VOW felt vulnerable, exposing. But Mara reminded me, "You're not hiding anymore. You're leading," so I did it. I spoke honestly about reinvention, about women reclaiming themselves after being dismissed or diminished. The article went live under the headline, "From Silence to Power, the Woman Behind VOW." The next morning, I woke up to thousands of messages, women sharing their own stories of walking away, rebuilding, beginning again. Some said my words made them cry. Others said they'd finally left. It wasn't just business anymore. It was movement. But behind the triumph, I still had moments when I'd catch myself in the mirror and feel that old ache, the one that whispered, "He doesn't know who you are now." And yet, maybe that was the victory. I didn't need him to know. I didn't need anyone's acknowledgement to make my existence valid. My success wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. That night, I stood by the studio window, city lights flickering like applause in the distance. Orders kept coming, and I knew this was only the beginning. For years, I'd been silenced, underestimated, reshaped to fit someone else's world. Now my name was on the elevator doors open to a floor of glass, light, and quiet power. My name, VOW Studios, gleamed in gold lettering across the marble wall. From my office, the skyline stretched endlessly, a constellation of ambition I had once only dreamed of touching. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, warm against the polished wood and the soft hum of creation filling the air. Designers discussed fabric palettes in the corner. Stylists reviewed sketches for the Paris showcase. Every detail, the scent of espresso, the mood boards pinned with silk swatches, the steady rhythm of innovation, was proof that this was no longer a fragile dream. It was an empire. I stood by the window, fingers brushing the edge of my desk. A framed article hung nearby. From heartbreak to high fashion, the self-made powerhouse behind VOW. The word powerhouse still startled me sometimes, not because it wasn't true, but because of how far that word had traveled to find me. Years ago, my silence had been mistaken for weakness. Tonight, it was my legacy. I remembered that night at the luxury dinner, the laughter, the toast that tasted like humiliation, the slow burn of shame in my chest. For so long, that memory had been my shadow, but now, as I gazed over the city, it felt distant, like an old scene from a movie whose ending I had rewritten. The world saw success, the brand collaborations, the Forbes feature, the invitation to keynote a global summit. But what I cherished most were the messages from women who said VOW made them feel seen. "Your story gave me courage," one wrote. I started again too. That, I realized, was the real empire. Not the offices or the wealth or the fame, but the ripple effect of one act of defiance, walking away. Mara entered, tablet in hand, her smile knowing. "Your Milan team just confirmed. They're ready for the expansion launch." "Good," I said, my tone calm but sure. "Let's keep it elegant, always elegant." As she left, I looked at my reflection in the glass. No longer the woman who once stood at a dinner table pretending not to break. My posture was steady now, my expression composed. Strength had settled into my bones quietly, like light at dawn. In the distance, the city pulsed with life, each light a story of its own. Somewhere out there, Ryan might have seen the headlines. Maybe he envied the empire that rose from the ashes of his mockery. Maybe not. Either way, I no longer cared. My silence back then hadn't been surrender. It had been strategy. The pause before the roar. And now, as my team prepared the next collection, as the world waited for what VOW would do next, I smiled softly, because sometimes the loudest answer is the one you don't speak at all. I turned back to my work, calm, composed, and completely in command. My empire bloomed beneath the same sun that once witnessed my fall, and for the first time, I felt not vengeance, not pride, just peace. The message arrived on a Thursday morning, buried between meeting reminders and partnership proposals. It was from Ryan. I hadn't seen his name on my screen in years, yet there it was, cold, concise, professional. "Would you be open to discussing a potential collaboration opportunity?" For a long moment, I just stared at it. My coffee went cold in my hand. The irony was almost cinematic. His empire crumbling just as mine stood taller than ever. The headlines had already begun to circulate. Mercer Industries faces financial turmoil amid scandal. Investors were fleeing, partners withdrawing, and the man who once mocked my ambition was suddenly desperate to meet. I agreed. Not out of curiosity, but closure. I wanted to look him in the eye and feel nothing. When I arrived at the restaurant, ironically, the same one where he'd once humiliated me, it felt like stepping onto the set of a memory I'd already outgrown. The chandeliers still shimmered, the crystal still caught the light, but everything looked smaller now. Or maybe I'd simply grown. Ryan was already there, sitting alone at the corner table. He looked older, thinner. The smug confidence that had once defined him had been replaced by something brittle, a man aware that his grip on control was slipping. "Thank you for coming," he said, forcing a smile. His tone carried that familiar mix of charm and calculation. "I've been following your success. Quite impressive." I returned his smile, polite but unreadable. "Thank you. I've worked hard for it." He nodded, fiddling with his cufflinks. "I won't waste your time. My company is restructuring, and I think there's room for, well, synergy between us. You have influence, reach, and I—" His voice faltered. I could use your insight. There it was. The unspoken admission. The man who once told me I was too naive for real business now needed my help to survive it. I listened, calm and composed, as he tried to mask desperation with strategy. My mind drifted, not to the past, but to the woman I had become. I remembered walking out that night without my purse, my keys, or a plan. Only a promise to never let anyone make me small again. When he finished, I simply said, "It's interesting how things turn around, isn't it?" He blinked, unsure whether I was mocking him. "So, you'll consider it?" I smiled gently. "I'll think about it." But in truth, I already knew my answer. As I stood to leave, I caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. Once towering, now diminished. The same man who had laughed at my homemade dreams was now grasping for the woman who made them real. Outside, the air felt sharp and clean. My driver opened the car door, and I paused for one last glance through the restaurant's glass window. Ryan sat alone, staring down at his empty glass, like it might offer him another chance. But there are no second chances for those who build their power on someone else's silence. I got into the car, the city moving with me, not against me. The past had come knocking, but this time, I was the one holding the key. The restaurant was the same one where everything had once shattered. But tonight, the air felt different, warmer, mine. The maitre d' greeted me by name, leading me through the glittering hall where crystal light spilled over velvet seats. The hum of conversation surrounded me. Investors, editors, global partners, all gathered to celebrate VOW's newest collaboration with an international luxury house. At the head table, champagne flutes sparkled like captured stars. My team rose when I approached, smiling, proud. The woman who had once been an accessory to another man's ambition was now the center of the toast. "Here's to resilience," one of the executives said, lifting his glass. "To women who turn endings into empires." The table erupted in applause. I smiled, my fingers steady around the glass, though inside, I could still hear echoes of another toast years ago, the one that had cut me open. Back then, laughter had filled this room too, but it was laughter at my expense. Tonight, every sound was a reminder of how far I'd risen from that humiliation. And then, as if fate couldn't resist its own irony, Ryan appeared. I saw him before he saw me, standing awkwardly near the entrance, scanning the room with a look that blended nostalgia and regret. His suit was impeccable, but his eyes gave him away. Gone was the arrogant gleam. What remained was something hollow, uncertain. When our gazes met, he froze. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Then he composed himself and approached, carrying the faint smile of someone pretending not to be drowning. "Congratulations," he said softly when he reached the table. "You've built something incredible." "Thank you," I replied, my tone light but measured. "It's been a long journey." He laughed faintly. "You always had potential. I just didn't see it back then." I tilted my head, the corner of my mouth lifting. "You saw it. You just couldn't stand the thought of me outgrowing you." His expression flickered. Pain, denial, something unspoken. The people around us sensed the tension, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent years shrinking myself for his comfort. I wasn't about to do it again. As the servers refilled glasses and cameras flashed, one of the executives leaned in. "We were just toasting to the power of reinvention," he said. "Perhaps Ms. Mercer could share a few words." Ms. Mercer. I hadn't used his last name in years, but hearing it now felt poetic, like reclaiming it just to prove it no longer owned me. I stood, the room falling into a respectful hush. "Reinvention," I began, letting the words settle in the air. "Starts with remembering who you are when no one believes in you." I used to sit at a table like this, same restaurant, same lights. But that night, I was silent. I laughed when it hurt, stayed when I should have walked, but silence can be powerful when you learn to use it. I glanced at Ryan, holding his gaze as I continued. "Someone once mocked our marriage like it was a joke," I said, my voice calm, steady. But I built the punchline. A ripple went through the table. Some laughter, some shock, all admiration. Ryan looked down, the color draining from his face. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had already done the work. When I sat back down, my colleagues toasted again, louder this time. The sound filled the room like applause from the universe itself. Ryan lingered a moment longer, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, he whispered, "You really don't need me anymore, do you?" I met his eyes one last time. "I never did," I said gently. "I just needed to remember that." He nodded, a faint tremor in his jaw, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the glittering blur of laughter and light. I lifted my glass again, to no one and everyone at once. "To freedom," I murmured. The table cheered. The cameras clicked. And as champagne shimmered under the chandelier's glow, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a story coming full circle. Not revenge, but resolution. The woman who once walked out in silence had returned, not to relive the past, but to rewrite its ending. And this time, the laughter was mine. When the dinner ended and the crowd drifted away, I lingered by the window overlooking the city. The music had faded, leaving only the soft murmur of night and the faint clinking of glasses being cleared. Ryan was gone, vanished without another word. And yet, somehow, his silence echoed louder than all the years of his arrogance. For so long, I had imagined this moment as a victory. I thought I'd feel triumphant, that watching him finally crumble would fill the hollow space he left behind. But standing there, wrapped in the quiet hum of my own success, I felt something far deeper. Peace. His downfall wasn't my doing. It was his choices catching up to him. The lies, the ego, the way he built everything on belittling others. It all came back around, just as I once knew it would. Karma didn't need an audience. It just needed time. I remembered the woman I used to be, apologizing for speaking too loudly, shrinking when he dismissed my ideas, convincing myself that love was meant to be endured, not reciprocated. That woman had vanished the night I walked out without looking back. Tonight, standing in the same restaurant where he once mocked me, I realized she hadn't died. She had transformed. Mara found me by the glass, her smile soft. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, still watching the city lights. More than okay. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then she said quietly, "He didn't deserve to see this version of you." "Maybe not," I replied. But I needed to see him, to realize I'm no longer angry. The truth of that hit me gently. Anger had fueled me for years, driving every sleepless night, every design, every decision. But now, the fire had cooled into something stronger. Clarity. Ryan's silence, once oppressive, now felt like music. It wasn't awkward or heavy. It was a final note at the end of a long, dissonant song. I had spent years trying to compose harmony in a marriage built on control. But tonight, I finally heard my own melody, as the city stretched before me, alive, glittering infinite. I understood that my story was never about revenge. It was about returning to the woman I'd buried under his expectations, returning to my voice, my purpose, my peace. When I left that restaurant years ago, I had nothing. No money, no plan, no certainty. Just the fragile strength of knowing I couldn't stay where I wasn't valued. Tonight I walked out again. But this time, I carried an empire behind me, and a heart that finally felt free. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. I took a deep breath, the city lights shimmering like applause I didn't need but still appreciated. Somewhere out there, Ryan was probably replaying the evening, wishing he'd said something, done something different. But the silence between us was final and merciful. As I stepped into my car, I caught my reflection in the window. Calm, certain, whole. His silence had once been my cage. Now, it was my symphony. And as the car pulled away, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I was finally done keeping score. Sometimes, I drive past the old restaurant on my way to the office. The building still gleams beneath its chandeliers, the same polished marble, the same over-polished people walking in and out. But now, towering above it, a massive billboard stretches across the skyline, a model draped in one of my designs, the words, "VOW," for those who rose. Every time I see it, I smile. Not with pride, but with a quiet kind of disbelief. I had once left that very place with nothing but my dignity, and somehow that turned out to be everything. These days, my work isn't just about fashion. It's about transformation, the same kind I went through. My foundation funds scholarships for young women who were told they weren't enough. I meet them every month, listening to their dreams, their fears, their small victories. When I hand them their acceptance letters, I see the reflection of the girl I used to be, frightened, but holding on to one final spark of self-worth. I tell them, let that spark guide you, even when the world tries to smother it. In my office, the walls are lined with framed headlines and photos of women who've come through our mentorship programs. One of them recently launched her own label. Another just became the creative director at a firm that once rejected her. Watching them rise fills me with a satisfaction no award or fortune could match. I've learned that freedom isn't loud. It doesn't always roar with revenge or shine with gold. Sometimes it's simply the ability to walk past your past, without flinching. Last week, I walked down that familiar street again, not in designer heels or accompanied by anyone. Just me, a cup of coffee, and the hum of the city I rebuilt my life in. The doorman from years ago held the door for a new couple entering the restaurant. She was nervous, clutching her partner's arm. I almost wanted to tell her, "You'll be fine. Even if tonight breaks you, you'll rise again." But instead, I just smiled and kept walking. As I passed under the glow of my own billboard, the wind caught my hair, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby stand. The same perfume I wore the night I walked away. I realized I had come full circle. Freedom isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision not to let it define you. And as I turned the corner, leaving the restaurant behind once more, I whispered to myself, not out of pride, but out of peace, I'm finally home. For years I thought silence meant surrender, that saying nothing was the same as giving up. I used to fill every quiet moment with explanations, apologies, promises, as if words could make someone see my worth. But I was wrong. Silence was never weakness. It was strength learning how to breathe. When I finally stopped trying to convince Ryan, the world, or even myself that I was enough, I started to become more than enough. Every quiet morning I spent working alone. Every night I went to bed without validation. Those were the moments I built myself from the inside out. Silence gave me space. Space to grieve the life I lost, to rediscover the woman I'd buried under perfection and performance. It gave me room to grow without permission, to create without fear, to exist without needing applause. I used to crave closure, some grand moment where he'd admit he was wrong. But the truth is, I didn't need it. The silence between us was the closure. It said everything. Now, when I wake up and step into my world, a world I created with my own 2 hands, the quiet hum of the morning feels like a symphony. My life no longer echoes with his voice or his expectations. It's filled with my own rhythm, steady, certain, whole. I once believed that being unseen was the worst fate a woman could face. But I've learned that the real victory is being seen by yourself. So yes, I was silent, but in that silence, I found my strength, my peace, my voice. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you start building yourself.